Welcome to Stories of Art. I'm James Fox.
And I'm Alastair Sook.
A group of travellers is walking along a path near Mount Fuji when a sudden gust of wind catches them unaware. A woman's dress is blown into her face. A man's beloved hat is snatched off his head. And a backpack is ripped open, sending dozens of valuable sheets of paper hurtling off into the sky. That, Alastair, is a chaotic scene from Hokusai's most thrilling series of images, which we will discuss in this episode. But before we do that, let's remind listeners where we got to in our previous episode. Hokusai is born in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, in 1760. He takes on various jobs in his youth, is sacked in his 30s, but goes on to make a name for himself as a freelance artist. He loses 2 wives, 1 daughter, gets struck by lightning, has a stroke, but races through into old age without pausing for breath. This, then, is the second and last episode on the story of Katsushika Hokusai. We're now in the 1830s, and Hokusai, though by no means a young man, he's now in his 70s, he's about to get a second wind. And I just thought, Alastair, I would read this famous quote by Hokusai.
You got to do it.
It's so fantastic, and I think it captures everything you need to know about him. And this is what he writes. Ever since I was 6, I have been obsessed with drawing the shapes of things. By the time I was 50, I had published countless drawings, but nothing I produced before the age of 70 is worthy of note. Not until I was 73 did I begin to understand the structure of nature as it truly is, the structure of animals, plants, trees, birds, fish, and insects. Thus, by the time I am 80, I will have made some real progress. At 90, I will have fathomed the mystery of things. At 100, I will surely have reached a phenomenal level. And when I'm 110, everything I do, be it a dot or a line, will be alive. I would ask anyone living as long as I do to see I am true to my word. Isn't that great?
I mean, it's mind-blowing. It's such a phenomenal quotation. It's like it's come to be seen as his personal artistic credo. I quite like it for a number of reasons, but one of them, just to be purely subjective, is we're both now in our 40s, and it's really great and inspiring to hear someone say that nothing they did until they were 70 is worth any attention whatsoever. I think that's inspiring. It also strikes me, and this is a personal experience thing, but over the years I've interviewed lots of contemporary living artists, obviously, and invariably, really strong, good artists hate being asked about past work. I remember vividly going to talk to the sculptor, British sculptor who's dead now, Anthony Caro, who was really big in the 60s. And I kept on saying, so what was it like in the 60s? And he's like, I don't care about the 60s. I care about what I'm working on now, what I'm making tomorrow. And I think that's a sign of real creativity, that sort of surging forward and that creative restlessness. You really get it in that quote.
You absolutely do. And the other thing is, he's completely right, because it's in his 70s that he goes on to produce perhaps his greatest work, certainly more exciting, more famous than anything he's made before. And the works we're about to discuss, Alastair, prove it. Absolutely the case. So in the early 1830s, when he's in his early 70s, Hokusai embarks on a new series of woodcut prints that are called the 36 Views of Mount Fuji.
Probably worth clarifying that, confusingly, there aren't 36 views of Mount Fuji. There are 46 in the end.
46. He makes an additional 10 because it's so successful. But I think before we get going, we do need to probably say something about Mount Fuji itself.
Yes, of course.
I mean, I'm sure all of our listeners can picture Mount Fuji. It's this ludicrously perfectly shaped mountain.
A cone, sort of perfect cone.
It's a perfect cone. It's actually a volcano, and it had erupted actually not long before Hokusai was born, in the early 1700s. But it's this perfect shape, and it's become a great symbol of Japan.
And where is it in Japan?
Well, it's just outside of Tokyo, of Edo, so where he lives. So he would have grown up, and he would have been able to see the great conical shape of Mount Fuji in the distance on a clear day. And it's such a kind of a epitome of Japan. You see it together with cherry blossom. Usually there's a bullet train in the foreground. It's absolutely everywhere. And it's very symbolically important. Symbolic not just of Japan itself, but of Edo, of spiritual beliefs, about this idea of purity, about nature, about the seasons. All these big ideas that are very important to Japanese people get crystallized in the form of that mountain.
So, it's a sacred peak. I mean, is it fair to even think of it as itself a kind of deity?
It is, in some ways, a deity. I'm trying to think, actually, if there is any comparison in the UK, and I can't really think of anything. I mean, it's part White Cliffs of Dover, part Westminster Abbey,
right,
part Stonehenge. It's got these spiritual connotation, but it also feels like a very important landmark. It's not just nature, it's also culture, it's religion. It's got absolutely everything. And artists had been fascinated by Mount Fuji, and writers had been fascinated by Mount Fuji for hundreds and hundreds of years. Hokusai is by no means the first person to embrace it. But one of the things that happens in this period in the 1820s and the 1830s is that partly as a result of the great peace and stability of the Tokugawa shogunate, there is fantastic infrastructure. Then as now, so there's great infrastructure in Japan now. As you go on the bullet train from Tokyo to Kyoto, you can see the mountain outside. But even back then in the 1820s, 1830s, there was a massive tourist industry. People were traveling all over Japan, and they were traveling to visit Mount Fuji, and they were climbing up Mount Fuji, which is seen as a very important thing for a Japanese person to do.
So there's an appetite for imagery of these places that people are visiting. They become famous.
There's an appetite for landscape imagery in general.
Fascinating.
And we begin to see more and more landscape appearing.
I mean, it is interesting because I know that around this same period, this late phase where he makes his most famous print imagery, there are other series as well, aren't there? Just to kind of set that in context. So we're about to discuss in some depth the 36 views of Mount Fuji, but he also depicts the waterfalls of all the provinces.
Those are lovely pieces.
Or I think there's another one, the bridges in all the provinces. So it gives a sense, again, of that, the commercial imperative, the publishers recognizing there is an appetite and need within the Japanese public for images like this. And Hokusai is essentially, he's catering to it.
He's catering to this is how it still is the case now. You know, you might see online the famous photograph of Mount Fuji and you think, oh, I want to go and see that myself. And so you'll seek it out, and then you might take a photograph yourself, or you might buy a postcard next to the viewpoint. That is exactly what these images are doing.
And as you established earlier on in this conversation in the previous part, these prints are relatively inexpensive. So they're affordable things that people can buy and then put up, and it's within reach for many, many people.
We mentioned it in the previous episode, didn't we, that you could buy these woodcuts for the price of a large bowl of noodles. So we're talking £3 or £4. You could buy a Hokusai. You could not get a Hokusai for that money nowadays. And so a number of people are making landscapes at this time. There are lots of images of Mount Fuji, but really I think he depicts it like no one before him.
Well, it's interesting you say that he depicts it almost as though, I mean, I know you're not really saying this, but almost as if it's in a sort of singular fashion. Because the extraordinary thing about this series of images is how much variety, how inventive compositionally these pictures are. There is this, he used to be at the British Museum, it's a wonderful specialist scholar of Japanese art, a man called Timothy Clark, who curated a very big Hokusai show at the British Museum a few years ago. I mean, he refers to this specific publication as one of the greatest illustrated books ever. And he has this phrase, which has always stayed with me, that it's almost as if within the series, Hokusai is playing a game with the viewer of hide and seek with Mount Fuji. Yes. Because sometimes it takes a while. You're looking at an image and you're thinking, here's, say, people walking along and going about their business, or labourers on a roof or whatever. Well, sorry, where's the mountain?
Yes.
And it's tiny, it'll be sort of far away in the distance. And that's quite wonderful in terms of just thinking about it artistically, this kind of inventiveness he's bringing.
Yeah, as I was coming over here this morning, I actually thought it reminded me of the great Japanese film Rashomon. You know, the Kurosawa film, because the great thing about the Kurosawa film, what makes Rashomon so important is he tells the same story from 4 different perspectives, one story after the other after the other. No one had really ever done that in cinema before. But in a way, that's what Hokusai's doing. He's depicting this one mountain, but he's doing it from every different possible perspective. He's doing it from different angles, from different distances, different weather conditions, different lighting conditions, different foregrounds. Sometimes you're right. Sometimes the mountain is very obviously visible. It's the only thing. And sometimes you can barely see it. It's hidden behind something. So it's so restlessly ingenious and inventive.
Did you say that it's partly that he's depicting the mountain at different times of the day?
Oh, yes, certainly.
In different seasons, different moments in the year. I think that, as an artistic invention, is really, maybe this sounds hyperbolic, but profoundly important, because later on, that influences some big name Western artists. We'll come on to this, but this is the moment, in a sense, where some of the seeds of, weirdly, Western modern art are being laid in the 36 views of Mount Fuji in the early 1830s.
Well, we will come to that. It's really very, very interesting. But I just have to say, this series, I love it so much.
Have you got some favourites?
I've got, every single one. I find every single image thrilling and delightful and exciting in a different way. I think every picture is a winner. Everyone has something audacious about it. Do you know what I mean? I mean, every image, there's some, whether it's an amazing compositional device or an extremely madly brave use of colour or an ingenious play on form, or there's a great joke or they're hilarious. The ideas you feel at this point in Hokusai's life in his 70s are just tumbling out of him. He can't contain them. The inventiveness, the ingenuity of his image making at this time is awe-inspiring.
Can I say? I mean, this is a very brief. I know I can always feel it when I go on a tangent, and you're a bit, oh God, come on, stick to the story. But there is something that I find so fascinating in art history, and it is a phenomenon that art historians have created and come up with, which they call late style. And it's much debated and disputed about what it is. But if you buy into it, it is the idea that great artists often, when they have a very long life, in the final years of their life, they somehow feel uninhibited, unfettered, and they start to create art they just break all of the rules. It's a sort of supreme ease and confidence. The great examples would be Rembrandt, or in This Is Western Art, someone like Matisse. But it seems to me that Hokusai is another archetypal example of the great late style of an old age artist.
That's really interesting. I don't know. I feel that in some ways, when you look at these images, though, they feel like a young man's art. Because they are so joyfully irreverent, rule-breaking, full of energy, full of vitality. They feel very fresh. You wouldn't think that these are the late works of an artist, but I just think they are remarkable. I think in some ways you will disagree with me here, Alastair, because you're a more subtle thinker than I am. But I think they make a mockery of everything that's happening in Europe at the time. You know, in the 1830s, you compare European art of the 1830s to what Hokusai is doing with these images. Is there anything remotely as convention-busting as what he is producing in this series?
I mean, that's just sheer provocation, James. I cannot quite... I mean, I get what you're saying. They are tremendously important. I'm not sure I'd completely write off the Western tradition at this moment. Nevertheless, I hear very, very loud and clear and agree with your tremendous passion for these images.
But what is there? I mean, if you think, what is there in Europe? Okay, Turner is beginning to produce some very significant landscapes at this point, but he's not gone completely wild.
But are we having to compare piece for piece 1831 with 1831 in, say, France? Because by the 19th century, quite a lot's happened in the Western tradition that is itself quite revolutionary and radical and exciting, which is not in any way to downplay Hokusai. I wonder whether, in a sense, you're channeling, rightly so, and I get it, what a lot of Western artists in the 19th century start to see. They start to see an alternative to that tradition they're steeped in. And it's really exciting to them because suddenly you have anarchic viewpoints. You have a very flat, bold use of colour, strange compositions. These are things which people like, I don't know, Degas or Monet or Van Gogh or Gauguin, they're all really thrilled by. And possibly we are their children, in a sense, in taste terms, in still finding those same exciting points about Hokusai's art.
Well, there are 36, there are actually 46. He actually then goes on to make 100 views of Mount Fuji in black and white, which are less famous. I think we should home in on one of them. And we should home in on the most famous of them all, which is, of course, the Great Wave of Kanagawa. Do you want to describe this?
This is probably the most famous image in all of Japanese art. And what you see is a huge storm wave out at sea on the left of the image, which is a deep, deep blue and rearing up like some sea monster or kraken or serpent. And it's about to break on top of, in between other smaller wave peaks, you suddenly spy, I think it's 1, 2, 3 narrow, speedy boats, which have people inside them that are clearly cowering and huddled because they feel that this great breaker is about to smash on top of them and it's going to imperil their lives. And in the distance, talked about the hide and seek of Fuji, you think, that's a strangely conical blue and white wave that's far away. And suddenly you go, there is the mountain, which you see almost through the wave. And this is a kind of key point about it, isn't it? It's suddenly there's this sense of depth and perspective, and just tiny at the back, but the waves echo its sacred form, is the nearly 4,000 metre or whatever it is, high peak of Mount Fuji.
Well, you mentioned actually earlier how often the mountain is hiding. And it's true that it does, in this picture, it hides in plain sight. In that many people will recognize this image. It's one of the most famous images, not just in Japanese art, but in global image making. And yet how many people spot the mountain? It looks like a wave, doesn't it? You have to look closely to recognize what this is. I think this image is rightly famous because it is so graphically simple, isn't it? It's become a kind of logo in a way.
It's definitely a logo. I mean, some people talk about it being the first maybe viral work of art. I think the thing that just comes across, it's fascinating to hear what you're saying, because you've set up a context where for Hokusai and the original audience, the context is thinking about Mount Fuji, which is here in the background. Part of its resonance now, I think people, when they look at it, they may not see Mount Fuji at all, but what they will immediately recognize is this elemental tussle between man and nature.
Which is more relevant even now in this age of rising sea levels and climate crisis and the tsunamis that Japan has faced in recent years.
So I think it's taken on additional sort of catastrophic resonance, if you like.
And it's particularly dramatic, actually, if you are a Japanese viewer, because if you are looking at this image from a Western perspective, we in the West read images just as we read text from left to right. And Japanese people read images and text from right to left. And so if you're a Western viewer, you are traveling with the wave. You're surfing the wave. It's lots of fun.
Yes.
If you are a Japanese viewer, you are being hit by that wave.
And
it's nowhere near so much fun. And so I think we don't, in the West, completely capture how audacious, how violent that image actually is.
It's such a good point. And then when you actually look at the big wave itself, we should describe too the way Hokusai has given it form, because you have these large undulating, the underside of the wave, which is deep blue, but it seems to be breaking in this moment, and the foamy crest of the wave, the top of it, you have what look like tiny little, loads of them, talons, claws, as though it is itself some sort of monstrous figure. And you have these white, I mean, this is such bravura in terms of the artisanship that's gone in, if that's a word, that's gone into creating this image. These tiny flecks of foam, which seem to be coming off the crest of the wave, little white dots, which start to scatter over in the image above the area where in the distance we see Mount Fuji, and it becomes as though is it foam or is it a representation almost of snowfall on the summit of Mount Fuji? There's a wonderful quote, which it's sort of irresistible because it throws to this story that I know I've been talking about quite a lot, but the European reception of this Japanese art. You have a moment in the 19th century in France where a very famous French writer, Edmond de Goncourt, he talks about and uses this phrase to describe those little talons that you see at the top of the wave. And his phrase is as though the wave's crest seems to disperse in I'm going to try the French.
Oh, please.
Une pluie de gouttelettes, a rain of droplets, which are formed as de griffes d'animaux, the animal claws. And there's this sense of something animalistic that's within the wave itself.
Well, this, I think, is part of Japanese religious history, because if you look back in Japan all the way through to Shintoism, there is a long-held ancient sense within Japan of natural forms, whether they be rocks or trees or waves or mountains, having a spirit.
Yes.
Themselves, being animate beings. And I think absolutely Hokusai is drawing on that. He's depicting Mount Fuji as a kind of being in its own right, an entity, but he's also depicting the wave as a kind of monster. I think it's deliberate.
I quite, in a funny way, I sometimes think when I look at the little talons, they almost look like, you get those head massagers with the sort of implements that, the sort of long spindly metal bits. It's like lots and lots of those that potentially could be a slightly nicer experience. But taking tongue out of cheek for a second, the other thing I think when I look at this, and you've mentioned the famous quote where he's saying, look, anything I did before a certain age is not worth looking at. This isn't the first time that Hokusai depicts waves. And if we're being brutally honest, some of those earlier depictions of waves that Hokusai creates, they're not that good. They look really hard and rigid. They always, whenever I see them, they look a bit like they could be some sort of laser beam light show. Or they look like, do you remember those boiled sweets, Fox's Glacier Mints?
Yes, of course.
Of course. That's sort of like that. They feel like they have that consistency, that texture, as though they're hard. Whereas here, you have a sense of great undulating motion, a sense of the study of water. He's evoked something of the spirit of water, if you like, the essence of it.
And I think those claws are also, in some ways, a technical solution. Remember, he spent that time in his early years as a block cutter. How do you depict froth? How do you depict something as amorphous as water by cutting a line into a block of wood? Because
such a good point.
Let's remember this is a wood block cut. And he has created the solution, which is creating these very sort of graphic claws, talons, fingers, whatever we want to call them, as a way of expressing that kind of frothy foaminess.
Yes. And it's interesting because you do read it as the viewer. You can see it's not naturalistic.
No.
It is stylized. And yet it communicates something of the frothiness of froth instantly.
And the other thing it does visually, which I find so exciting, is this image becomes a kind of fractal.
What do you mean?
Well, those fingers, those clawy fingers, echo the overall shape, the overall claw-like shape of the wave. And
I see.
It is made from this very actually economical set of shapes. You've got half circles, you've got claw-like shapes, that is building this extremely complex composition. I think the other thing that we should say is the colour is very important.
Ah, yes.
Because Hokusai uses, for this image, and for many of the images in the 36 views of Mount Fuji, a brand new pigment that has pretty much only recently arrived in Japan, and that is Prussian blue.
So it's called Prussian blue because it's first synthesized in Berlin.
Yes.
So this is a European pigment. And I think one of the things that I find so fascinating because you've begun by saying this is such a famous work of art, we've established this is the first sort of, if you like, viral work of art, and it's seen as being an exemplar of Japaneseness, of Japanese art. But actually, in terms of that depth of perspective, looking through to the mountain, in terms of, as you say, the use of this Prussian blue pigment, it's got a relationship with European developments, European art as well.
Absolutely. So Prussian blue had been invented, as you say, in Berlin. It's a very good pigment, actually. I'm obviously not as splendid as ultramarine, but a very practical, light, fast pigment.
When you say light, fast, you mean it doesn't fade in the light?
Doesn't fade. And the blues that Japanese artists had at their disposal before this were not light fast. So
and interesting, here you do see another blue. There is an indigo, which is used for, I think, the characters on the left, but also the outlines, right?
Yeah. Indigo was the standard blue, the go-to blue. There were a couple of others as well, but the go-to blue for Japanese printmakers. And it wasn't very light fast. And so in the late 1820s, in the lead up to the creation of this work, Prussian blue starts to find its way into Japan. So we say that trading routes were closed. They weren't completely closed, where there are some Dutch traders who were able to do some things. And we think it's the Dutch trading posts that bring the first little batches of Prussian blue.
I think I'm right in saying that Hokusai actually creates some European-style paintings earlier in his life for some of those Dutch traders.
Yes.
So we know that there's an established relationship there.
Yes, and in his manga, which we discussed in the previous episode, he actually does a whole page on European-style perspective, where he was teaching Japanese artists how to create spatial recession in the way that Europeans did. So he was aware, trading routes weren't completely closed. There were bits and pieces coming through. And in about 1829, 1830, the lead up to this series, Prussian blue prices fall. And this is when the publisher, and I say publishers, as we discussed in the previous episode, have all the power, came to Hokusai and said, let's do a series based on Prussian blue. And actually, the series is advertised with the words Prussian blue. It says a series of images of Mount Fuji in Prussian blue.
As though presumably that's quite exotic for people. Always a bit of a sort of European sophistication.
It's a novelty. And so that is why I think another reason why he decides to focus this image on the sea, because it gives him an opportunity to put lots of this new Prussian blue into the picture. But it's a fantastic, fantastic picture. And
do you have a sense of who these people are in the boats?
Well, they are fishermen. There are debates about what specifically they're going to do. People have tried to identify the exact geographical area. We know it's off Kanagawa. We think they actually haven't finished fishing, but they're heading to the port to pick up fish. They're going to then take up the coast to the next town.
One of the things that I find quite fascinating about this is that it's quite rare, I think, in Hokusai's output to find an image like this where you're actually right on the outside and looking back towards Japan. If you see that Mount Fuji, it's basically a symbol of Japan. Here we are outside looking in. And so some people have read into the image, is it this image of great anxiety, that its outside forces may be coming to threaten Japan? Maybe that's psychologically in the mass subconscious what's going on, why an image like this resonates then. But I also have this sort of slightly off the slightly random theory. But if you like, this has been very successful in the West. And in a sense, you could argue that this compositional device looking from outside into Japan is a mirror, if you like. It's sort of self-reflexive for Western viewers, where we are ourselves looking at Japan from the outside. And I just wonder whether maybe that's a little added element for its success.
That's very interesting. What about comparing it to someone like Turner? Turner in this time is depicting dramatic storms and seas. There's one great story in which Turner at around the same time goes out onto a ship in the middle of a snowstorm and lashes himself to the mast in order to observe the sea and the elements in their full ferocious majesty. Do you feel there's some productive comparison there between what's happening in Japan in the 1830s, what's happening in other landscape traditions at this time, the Romantic period?
I think there's a hugely productive comparison to be made there. I can't help noticing that Turner's born only a few years after Hokusai. John Constable, another great landscape artist in Britain, is born just a year after Turner. And so, I don't know why, there seems to be this sort of global zeitgeist moment where landscape, for different reasons in different places, is becoming a central motif within art. You talk about the famous story of Turner lashing himself to the mast. The painting that comes out of that is phenomenally exciting. And if I'm being completely honest, and I don't think you're going to like this, I hadn't thought about it. I've got to say, it has a similar cyclonic vortex-like element, but it feels, in the Turner painting, it's like sort of semi-abstract. It's just swirling. You just sense it in a much more visceral way. You feel you're at sea in a storm. This is brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and I love it. But I cannot get away, and I think this is true of a lot of Japanese art in general. There is this sense which is foregrounded. It's not like this is a demerit, but it is stylized. You never forget the artifice. Partly, as you say, for technical reasons, how can you convey?
Yeah, I'd like to see Turner carve a woodblock.
Well, indeed, exactly.
But anyway, I mean, it is very interesting to reflect on this period of time. You're right. On opposite sides of the world, very different pictorial traditions. People are turning to landscape. They're turning to depict landscape in particularly powerful ways. And we will say more about the Great Wave. We'll talk about its legacy and its global impact in a moment. But let's go to a break. And after it, we will return to complete the story of Hokusai's life, which I'm afraid, dear listener, continues to be stalked by chaos.
To see images of all of the artworks in this episode and all our episodes, visit heni.com/storiesofart or visit the HENI Talks YouTube channel.
Welcome back. It's 1839. Hokusai is 79 years old, and not content with having been struck by lightning, which we discussed in the previous episode, Hokusai now finds himself trapped in an inferno. A fire breaks out in his home, Hokusai braves the flames and runs in to save his precious paintbrushes, but everything else is lost.
Oh, this is terrible. I mean, it supposedly had this wooden cart, didn't he? Which you've mentioned, I think, in the previous episode, that he supposedly moved house 93 times.
93 times.
And quite often you sort of imagine there he goes from one rented place to the next, pulling this wooden cart, which contains all of these reference drawings that he's created, which his artistic tools, he needs this stuff. And at this moment in 1839, all of that goes up in smoke.
All of those I mean, he was moving for lots of different reasons. One thing was economic insecurity, which was always part of his life. Apparently there's also that he was filthy.
Right.
Have you heard this?
Oh,
apparently he never tidied up, and sometimes his home got so filthy that he just thought, I'll just leave and move houses. And so he would move houses.
Brilliant
and then
solution.
The clutter would build and he'd decide to move again. It's an economical solution in some ways.
It's maybe also worth just very, very briefly, I mean, it's not just Hokusai as an individual who's suffering at this moment, is it? Because I think in the 1830s, you suddenly have a moment of economic uncertainty. There are a number of famines. And there is a point where the shogunate, the military government, is having to provide for up to maybe 700,000 people. There's unrest in the countryside because people just were not able to eat, you know. So it is a time of difficulty and stress. You do wonder whether maybe there's something about the appetite for these often quite peaceful landscapes. Interestingly, the most famous view of Mount Fuji from the series we've just been discussing in Japan isn't what we know as the Great Wave. It's a different image.
The Red Fuji.
The Red Fuji. And that just feels, you know, where there's a particular very rare light effect, I think very early in the morning, where the entire peak looks like it's glowing red. You see a wonderful sky effect, tiny little trees, and the general feel is one of serenity and peace, which clearly in Hokusai's personal life and for many people living in Japan at this moment was not within reach quite.
Not within reach. And I think we also need to recognise, we forgot to say this earlier, is that, and it's still the case even today, that Japan and Japanese people are terrorised by nature in a way that we aren't in this country. There are volcanoes, there are earthquakes, there are tsunamis, there are constant fires tearing through Edo at the time as well. It is something that is part of Japanese life, that nature can be extremely dangerous. We live in a relatively benign countryside in the UK.
Temperate British weather
it's
that we're
pretty
obsessed with,
temperate
but
here.
yeah, it's
But
kind to us.
This is not the case for people of Hokusai's lifetime, people who live in Japan. So he's just had a fire tear through his home. And as we move into the 1840s and Hokusai moves into his 80s, his health begins to decline further.
Is this related to the stroke?
Possibly. We don't know. I mean, he is obviously in his 80s. This is very old for a Japanese person at this point.
I mean, it's just something I came across when I was, ahead of this conversation. I mentioned this scholar, Timothy Clark. His line, it really hit home for me. After this fire, as he's approaching, he's around about 80, and he describes Hokusai's condition as being reduced to near nakedness, looking like a beggar. And this is the state in which Hokusai, the great Hokusai, is facing what would be his final decade.
Yeah, I mean, he's virtually bedbound at this point, actually. So in his final years, he didn't really leave his bed. In fact, he spent 6 months of the year, the cold months of the year, under a lice-infested quilt.
Look, I'm so glad you brought this up. We need to have a moment with the lice-infested quilt because there is an image, isn't there?
There is a famous image of him at work with his daughter, his daughter actually goes on to become a very fine artist in her own right.
She's a key character for the story here.
So she actually takes on to become his carer, his apprentice. She produces some fantastic works. There's a painting she makes of the Yoshiwara, which is the brothel district at night, and it's phenomenally good.
I mean, I think there is a school of thought that wonders whether in these final years, she's clearly a talented independent artist in her own right. how much is she contributing to the Hokusai studio output?
Yeah, we don't know, but I think quite a significant amount probably.
I mean, the drawing where you can see him, I mean, is it worth just briefly describing it?
Yeah.
Because this is it's a drawing which was created by one of Hokusai's pupils and given to Hokusai's first major biographer. And you can see two figures in an interior, and one of them is using a brush to create a drawing, probably on paper, laid down on the floor on a tatami mat. And that is Hokusai. And he's semi-obscured because he has this quilt, the lice-infested quilt, as it will forever be known now, which is over his shoulders and supposedly doesn't really move from that, keeping warm. And he's partially obscured, maybe out of respect, by some timber beam in the foreground. But you can just see these bristling, I think they're eyebrows, and his hand, and a sense of his ongoing, persistent creative force. The daughter is on, as the viewer looks at the image, to the left, and she has this very long, she's sitting, she's not smiling, she has an unconventional hairstyle, and she has this very long tobacco pipe. I think all of those things give her this sense, certainly to a sort of modern viewer, certainly to me, sense of independent spirit. Mm-hmm. And you have in this place, there's a box on the wall where you could keep some tangerines, and all of that dirt you described about, I think there's evidence of that here, where you can see a lot of refuse discards just piled up in one corner.
Yeah,
and
very
so
Hokusai.
It's this real sense of the texture of his life at this moment in what it would have been the 1840s.
Yeah, I mean, the 1840s, his life is not very rich. He's either painting or sleeping,
Right.
really. And all of the practicalities are being sorted out by his daughter. You know, by this stage, Alastair, in the 1840s, he'd already lived twice as long as the average Japanese person. He'd done extremely well, but he was really determined to live even longer than that, as the quote that we started this podcast with. He was drinking potions. Did you know this? He'd sort of
for longevity.
He was inventing these potions and drinking them in the hope that he could keep himself alive. And you know the other thing he was doing in these final years in the 1840s? He was, every morning when he woke up, he would sort of remove the lice-infested quilt.
Yes.
And he would make a drawing of a lion.
Yeah.
A Chinese lion. And then, almost like throwing salt over your shoulder, whichever shoulder it is, he would throw it out of the window. And this was seen as his daily exorcism. This was to bring good luck. This was to ward off evil spirits.
I mean, this is very telling evidence for how a lot of imagery is being used in Japan at the time, because in the previous part, we did talk a bit about the so-called spring pictures, the shunga. I'm going to mention them again,
yes.
James. And one of the things we do know about shunga is that sometimes they would have what scholars would call as an apotropaic function. In other words, they could be used to ward off evil. You might have one of these pictures if you were going into battle to protect you, or it could ward off disease, say smallpox. And that's what he's doing with these pictures of Chinese lions. It also has a wonderfully performative aspect to it, to tie it to those earlier moments in his career where he is creating these enormous ephemeral performances, works of art. Here he is. It's almost like a sort of, it seems so lavish as a creative gesture to spend time doing this and then just chuck it out the window.
Yeah.
Nevertheless.
But it's still, it's a further evidence of his absolute creative fecundity, isn't it?
Yes.
That even right at the end of his life, he can barely move. He can't even stand up. He's still producing image after image after image after image.
I mean, there is, I wanted to read this because I found there's this brilliant quote from a letter that comes from the mid-1840s. At this point, Hokusai is about 87, and this person is describing him, and this is clearly him on a sort of, in a good moment at the end of his life. He says, even now, he, Hokusai, does trick paintings without glasses, okay, guy's 87, and detailed these block-ready drawings, the ones that would be applied to the blocks for the people to carve and then to print, without stooping over. Last spring in the rains, he walked from this place Nishi Ryokogu as far as Nihonbashi, so he's still active, and he was in fine fettle and didn't feel tired. Which is really sweet.
That's very uplifting,
so
isn't it?
You might be him at that point thinking, I want to get to at least 100, possibly 110, and think, I've got a pretty good shout.
Well, and he goes on in the final 3 months of his life. He paints what some consider to be his last masterpiece, which is the tiger in the snow, which is actually, I've chosen this one in a way, Alastair, because it's a painting. We often think of Hokusai exclusively as a woodcut artist, but actually he worked in all kinds of media.
Yeah.
And he painted a lot of paintings at the end of his life. And this is a hanging scroll. It's painted on silk. I just love this picture.
It is amazing. It is amazing. It's amazing partly for, if we're moving away from the printmaking, where it was commercial imperatives often dictating subject matter, I think what you find in this freer, late-style Hokusai is he turns to painting where it's much more personal.
Yes.
And he paints a number of motifs, often with these exotic beasts. So you've mentioned the Chinese lions. There are some monsters. There are demon quellers. And he paints here a tiger.
Yeah, he would never have seen a tiger because there were no tigers in Japan. Tigers only existed on the Asian continent. But it's a wonderful picture. We should describe it for our listeners. It's this wonderful, flowing, sinuous tiger that's flying through the air. It's shooting past these snow-covered bamboo branches. It's looking delightful. Its body is serpentine. It's got this perhaps even smiling face. And one of the things I love about this picture is the way that Hokusai has depicted the snow.
Yeah.
Either whether it's in the middle of a blizzard or whether it's the snow falling off the bamboo branches that the tiger makes its way through. He has just spattered, I mean, you talk about Jackson Pollock, but he's spattering white paint across the surface of the silk. It's just such a vital image, isn't it?
I think another detail that I love is the way that those... What plant is it? We're talking about bamboo. Which is like thick snow on top. But you see these little spiky elements.
Claws again.
He loves the claws.
He loves a talon.
And what was I think the word you used before was fractal. I mean, I don't know if I'm using this correctly now, but you have again here the claws of the tiger, which we can see all four of them. And they're very pointy. They're highlighted on the claws. They're very three-dimensional. They are clearly echoed visually by these sort of black bamboo spokes poking through. They look like there are lots of snowy tiger claws, as if there's a great oneness somehow to the cosmos. And you look at this and you just think, it must be about psychological projection. This must be in some way a self-portrait.
Yes.
It's this tremendous final flourish in which Hokusai is expressing something of his own true artistic identity. I mean, that tiger looks, I think you used the word flying. It's anatomically all over the shop. I mean, it just in no way does it resemble a tiger. It's barely even stripes. They look like these sort of, the patterns are amoebas which are forming and reforming along his
He's got
hides.
a green nose.
He's got a green nose and that weird grin. But nevertheless, there is something so engaging about it, which is it's totally beguiling.
I completely agree with you, and I think a lot of scholars agree with you, that this is a kind of symbolic self-portrait. It's a kind of final fling, isn't it? And the idea that Hokusai is sitting in his home, he's bedbound, he's emaciated, and he still sees himself as this vital, unstoppable being surging like a child through the snow.
I mean, it's slightly weird in a way, isn't it? Because it's that desire to live forever. I mean, or to live for incredibly long. I know he isn't quite 110 when he paints this, but that famous quote that you mentioned before, where he's aspiring to create a work of art where every dot and every stroke is as if it's alive.
Yes.
I think you feel that here.
You feel that. And there's on the far right of the image, at the bottom right, there's a seal.
Oh, yeah.
A red seal. That seal reads 100. So he's still got hope. He's still holding out hope. But unfortunately, even Hokusai couldn't fight immortality in the end. And in the early spring of 1849, he falls ill. And he knows death is coming. There's a wonderful quote. Can I read this? He writes to his friend. He writes, Enma is the god of the underworld. Enma is preparing to retire from business due to old age. So he has had a nice little house built in the country and has asked me to join him there, to paint him a kakemono. This is why I have to leave. And when I go, I'll take my paintings with me. I shall rent a small flat in Netherworld Street.
Wow.
Where I shall be happy to welcome you when you're passing through.
Oh, that's gorgeous.
And on
a small flat in Netherworld Street. I'd like to go and live there now.
And at 4 a.m. on the 10th of May, 1849, when he's 88 years old, he finally dies. And do you know, Alastair, what his final words are?
Go on, tell us.
He says, if heaven would only allow me 5 more years, I could have become a true artist.
It's incredible that even at that point, he's still. It's amazing humility in a sense, isn't it? And still at the moment of death to be thinking about the possibility that you could have improved in those final few seconds of life. He could still have just learned something. He could have done the next tiger would have been just that little bit better, you know?
It's humbling, it's inspiring, and it just captures him. It captures him in his impish sense of humour. It's got everything that I love about Hokusai. But let us talk in this final few minutes of this episode, Alastair, about his legacy.
Yes.
Because Hokusai dies as he lives in poverty, famous in Japan, completely unknown in 1849, really, around the world. But not long after his death, the Tokugawa shogunate, which has been running Japan for over 250 years at this point, begins to crumble. The Americans force open the Japanese ports. Trading with the rest of the world begins to start up. And in the 1850s and the 1860s, a flood of Japanese objects.
A great wave, you could even call
it. Thank you very much, yes. A great wave, a tsunami of Japanese objects, of lacquerware, of ceramics, of fans, of textiles, of books, begin to pour west.
Yes.
Into Paris, into London, into Vienna, into America. And one of the really interesting things about this, and it's been said many times, but it's so fascinating, is that when these Japanese merchants were packing up these wonderful objects to be sold on the continent in Europe, they used these ukiyo-e prints. They used woodblock prints, including Hokusai's woodblock prints, simply as wrapping paper, as padding, because the images were so worthless. They were so cheap, the paper was so easy to come by that they'd scrunch them up and use them to fill up the boxes. And of course, when modern artists, modern Western artists, who, you know, at this point in the 1850s, 60s, were becoming tired of academic conventions and were looking for new ways of making images, when they saw these woodblock cuts, not just by Hokusai, but many of them by Hokusai, they were astonished.
It's such a key moment in the story of modern Western art. And it's the origin story, really, where Hokusai and other artists associated with Japanese art of that era suddenly become this huge and unexpected influence on the course that Western painting is taken. And it's such a big phenomenon, this great wave of Japanese art and artifacts that arrives in the West, that very quickly there's a term that's coined to describe it. It's a French word, Japanisme.
Japanisme.
The sort of Japanisme, bien sûr. And, you know, there is this idea, I think I mentioned it before, that even in the 1850s, someone is coming across, a French artist is coming across in a print shop, Hokusai's manga, and immediately you have that engagement with the art. And when you start looking at the roll call of artists who are not just touched by, but genuinely thrilled and excited by Japanese art, it's extraordinary. So in Britain, you get a lot of stuff which is being sold at Liberty, the department store around the corner from where we're recording this now. And we know that there are people who either bought objects there or they've expressed their interest in Japanese art and culture. I mean, the artists include Rossetti, John Everett Millais, Edward Burne-Jones, James Abbott McNeill Whistler.
Oh, Whistler does some very Japanese-inspired pieces.
Of course, William Morris. But it's in France, and it's the avant-garde in Paris where it gets really exciting, because there you have people like Monet, Degas, you have Van Gogh, who are encountering all of these prints. And
Do you know what Degas says of Hokusai?
Tell me.
He says, Hokusai is not only one artist among others in the floating world, he is an island, a continent, a world in himself.
Well, given the length of his life and given his output, and I mean, it's a brilliant summation, isn't it, for the extent that he created.
What do you think these modern French artists, these impressionists and post-impressionists, what do you think they're seeing in Hokusai's work and in other Japanese works that is exciting and liberating?
I think you've alluded to it in what you said just before. They are frustrated with the Western tradition. They feel that what had ossified this great sort of Renaissance explosion, and over various centuries, it's become this academic, conventional way of representing the world, which is bound up with various socio-political things that they object to. And they need to find a new way of representing the world that chimes with the great modern spectacle that they see around them, post-industrial revolution. And what they're finding in those Japanese prints are things like asymmetrical composition.
Yeah.
You know, this really pure use of colour line, decorative motifs. There's a great and very famous painting, a portrait by Manet, so one of the great French 19th century artists, and he's painting the writer Zola. I'm sure you know it. It's in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And the reason I mention it is that this picture where you see Zola sitting, it's like a sort of key text, as it were, for Japanisme. Because there you have a Japanese screen, you have on the wall, there's a Japanese print. It's a statement in this portrait of everything that Zola and Manet and people like that at the time were interested in. It's a great celebration of, here's this new way of making art, and we can take stuff from it.
Yeah, it's not just exoticism. Obviously, that's playing a role. People are excited at all this stuff that's coming from the other side of the world. There's also something in the image making that is unheard of at the time. It's, as you say, it's these amazing diagonals, these asymmetric compositions, things cropped halfway across, which of course Degas and many other artists begin to use. It's these very theatrical viewpoints. It's this flattened space. It's rhythm. It's these big blocks of bright colour that is obviously part of the woodblock tradition as well, that they translate into painting. So it's an immensely influential, and what do you think? I mean, it's a counterfactual, but had these Japanese images not been discovered and encountered by European artists in the 1860s, 70s, would we still have seen Impressionism and those other movements unfold in the same way?
It's a fascinating question. I mean, I love this moment in art history. There are a whole number of areas which artists are looking to, which are not just Japanese art, which are basically non-conventional academic Western painting. So they could be, for example, slightly later, maybe it's the art of children. Maybe it's street art, maybe it's graffiti, maybe it's folk art of various other cultures. But lots of avant-garde artists, final years of the 19th century, early years of the 20th, they're looking elsewhere. And I think this interest, the obsession with Hokusai and Japanese art should be seen in that wider context. Nevertheless, you've just described them. There are particular hallmarks to the way that those Japanese images that are constructed, which you can just see wholesale. They're taken, they're adopted and then transformed by Western artists. So it would have been a different story for sure.
Yeah. Well, I think we are still in many ways living through an era of Japonisme now. I mean, the Great Wave in particular, you cannot move for the Great Wave.
I've been meaning to tell you this. I have a 6-year-old son, and we have been methodically going through Tintin. Yes. And there is a moment in one of the very early Tintins, The Cigars of the Pharaoh, where Tintin and Snowy find themselves in a sarcophagus out at sea. They're drifting around. They've been chucked off some ship. I mean, in a sarcophagus, bit weird. We don't need to get into that. And there's a storm, and you suddenly see the final panel of this particular page is Tintin saying to Snowy, "We're lost," as they are approaching an enormous storm wave.
And does it have a Clory-like quality to it?
It totally does. It feels, it's clearly on Hergé, the author of Tintin. It's clearly a homage to Hokusai. Something I'd never thought until you were talking earlier about the Great Wave. It's really interesting because when you look at, and this is now Western art Tintin, Tintin and Snowy are on the left, and Hergé has put that wave on the right of the image to show that as the Western viewer, you read it left to right, and there's the danger.
He got the memo.
He got the memo.
No, I mean, speaking of offspring, my 7-year-old son last week came back and was talking to me from school, talking to me about Hokusai. I said,
Really?
Hang on a second. I'm doing Hokusai. What are you talking about? And they had done Hokusai's wave at school. And
James, I should have taken the week off.
I know, and he has drawn his own wave. They were all encouraged to draw that wave. But I think as you travel around the country now, you can see the wave everywhere. It's on, in merchandising everywhere. You go into shops, you can find it on notepads, you can find it on T-shirts. You can
Is this
find it
in
on
Japan
clothes.
you're talking about?
No, here. If you step out into London, you will find it everywhere. It's inspired logos, the Quicksilver logo, for instance. It's on the front cover of books. There's a recent, very successful novel, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, has the Great Wave on the front of it. So it's absolutely everywhere. And I like to think that Hokusai, the man who always craved immortality, would be delighted that 175 years or so after his death, we are still talking about him.
For sure. I mean, James, I thought that was an exhilarating conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do follow Stories of Art wherever you get your podcasts. Maybe even leave a review.